I realized something was wrong the moment I stood in my own living room and felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Everyone was smiling. That was the part that unsettled me most. My husband's mother sat on the sofa with her hands folded neatly in her lap. His father stood by the window, nodding as if he were listening to a sermon. My husband hovered nearby, calm, attentive, almost proud. They weren't angry, they weren't defensive. They were unified. It was the kind of unity people admire from the outside, the kind they call a strong family. And I was standing alone in the middle of it. No one raised their voice. No one accused me of anything. They spoke softly, carefully, as if I were fragile. They told me I was overthinking. They reminded me how much pressure my husband was under. They spoke about reputation, about dignity, about how families like ours survived by staying quiet. Each sentence landed like a hand on my shoulder, guiding me back into place. That was when it hit me. This wasn't a conversation. It was containment. They weren't trying to convince me of anything. They were trying to make sure I didn't ask the wrong questions. And as I looked around at their composed faces, I understood something else, something colder. They believed this would work. They believed I would do what I had always done: endure, smile, stay silent. They had no idea that while they were busy protecting him, they had already placed the final decision in my hands. I had been married long enough to know the role I was expected to play. I was the reasonable wife, the calm one, the woman people praised for being mature, for not making scenes, for understanding how important family was. When tensions rose, I smoothed them down. When questions lingered, I let them pass. I learned early that my value, in their eyes, was tied to how little space I took up. I was 33 years old, and I had built my life around being dependable, not demanding. Supportive without being visible. Every sacrifice was framed as strength. Every silence was rewarded with approval. People liked to say I was lucky. Lucky to have a husband so devoted to his parents. Lucky to be part of a family with such a spotless name. What they never said was how much that image relied on my cooperation. My husband understood this better than anyone. In public, he was everything a man was supposed to be. Attentive, responsible, generous with his time and his concern. He spoke about me with admiration, always careful to emphasize how understanding I was, how patient. I watched strangers nod approvingly, as if my restraint were proof of his character. Standing beside him, I wasn't a partner. I was evidence. At family gatherings, the pattern was always the same. He took the compliments. I received the gratitude for putting up with so much. It was never said outright, but the message was clear. His responsibilities mattered. My discomfort was a small price to pay, and whenever I hesitated, whenever I let curiosity show for even a second, the same phrases appeared like rehearsed lines. Don't make things bigger than they need to be. Think about the family. You know how fragile our reputation is. They said these things gently, with concern in their voices, as if they were protecting me from something dangerous. I nodded. I thanked them. I let the moment pass. That was how peace was maintained. What none of them seemed to notice was how closely I listened. Silence, when you practice it long enough, sharpens your hearing. I heard what wasn't said. I noticed how explanations came too quickly, how stories were repeated word for word by different people. I saw how conversations shifted when I entered a room, how decisions were made without me and then presented as inevitable. These weren't accidents, they were habits, and habits reveal systems. I never believed our life was perfect. I simply understood that perfection was a performance, one that required discipline, coordination, and a great deal of trust. Trust they were certain I would never betray. They mistook my patience for ignorance, my restraint for fear. What they didn't understand was that silence had never meant agreement. It meant observation. While they were busy maintaining appearances, I was learning where the weight actually rested. I was paying attention to the structures beneath the smiles, The arrangements no one thought to explain to me because they assumed I wouldn't ask. By the time I stood in that living room, surrounded by calm voices and careful words, I already knew something important. Whatever they were protecting, it wasn't fragile because of me. It was fragile because it depended on my cooperation. And for the first time, I let myself imagine what would happen if I simply stopped providing it. By the time people start praising you for how little you ask for, you've already been trained. I didn't notice it happening at first. It crept in through compliments, through concerned smiles, through the quiet pride others took in my ability to adapt. I was the woman who understood how things worked. The wife who didn't need reassurance. The one who could be relied on to hold everything together without making anyone uncomfortable. In our marriage, my needs were never denied outright. They were simply postponed, reframed, softened until they no longer felt urgent. There was always a reason to wait, a responsibility that mattered more, a situation that required patience. Over time, I learned that wanting too much was considered a flaw, while endurance was praised as maturity. I adjusted accordingly. No one ever told me what to do. That was the clever part. Control didn't come as commands, but as expectations. If dinner ran late because my husband was with his parents, I adjusted my schedule. If plans changed because the family needed him, I smiled and said I understood. Every accommodation was voluntary, which made it impossible to resent. Or so they thought. Language did most of the work for them. Whenever something felt off, the same phrases appeared, dressed up as kindness. "You're strong, you can handle this." Other women would make a scene. "We're lucky you're not like that." Each sentence landed like a compliment, but it carried an instruction. Don't react. Don't question. Don't disrupt. I listened. I always listened. At family gatherings, I watched how the rules operated without being spoken. Loyalty came first. Image came second. Truth, if it appeared at all, was expected to wait its turn. Breaking these rules didn't lead to confrontation. It led to silence, coldness. The subtle sense that you had disappointed people who believed they were entitled to your obedience. I learned to read those signals quickly. A pause before someone responded. A glance exchanged over my shoulder. The way conversations softened whenever they drifted too close to anything real. I followed the rules because following them kept the peace. And peace, I had been taught, was my responsibility. What they never understood was that compliance and awareness are not the same thing. I knew exactly how I was being positioned. I knew that my role was to absorb discomfort so others wouldn't have to. I knew that my restraint made things easier for everyone else. And I knew that as long as I played this part, no one would question my place. They mistook my calm for acceptance, my silence for agreement. From the outside, I was the ideal wife. Friends spoke about me with admiration. Relatives praised my patience. People said things like, "She's so understanding," as if that were the highest compliment a woman could receive. They never asked what understanding cost. Inside, I was counting. I counted how often decisions were made without me, how frequently my presence was required to soften outcomes I hadn't chosen. I counted the number of times my husband spoke for both of us, confident that I would not contradict him. I noticed how often my silence was used as confirmation that everything was fine. The difference between how others saw me and who I was becoming grew wider each day. They saw someone who would never push back, never escalate, never force a reckoning. I was someone who observed, who waited, who learned where the boundaries actually were. There came a moment when I realized I had stopped seeking explanations altogether. Not because I believed them, but because explanations were distractions. They were meant to keep me focused on surface details instead of structures. Once I understood that, my frustration faded. Curiosity replaced it. I began to see the family less as individuals and more as a system. Each person played a role, repeating the same messages, reinforcing the same expectations. When one spoke, the others echoed. When one deflected, the rest followed. It was efficient. It was practiced. And it relied entirely on one assumption: that I would never step outside the role they had assigned me. I didn't challenge them. I didn't push. I didn't confront my husband or demand clarity. I continued to show up, to listen, to nod. From their perspective, nothing had changed. I was still the woman who understood her place, who valued harmony above all else. What they couldn't see was that my silence was no longer passive, it was deliberate. There is a difference between staying quiet because you're afraid of the consequences and staying quiet because you're waiting for the right moment. I had crossed that line without announcing it to anyone. The questions I stopped asking were replaced by a different kind of attention, not emotional, structural. By the end of that chapter of my life, I no longer needed reassurance. I no longer needed their approval. I understood the rules well enough to know exactly where they failed. And as they continued to congratulate themselves for having a wife who knew her place, I quietly accepted the only truth that mattered. They believed my silence was permanent. They were wrong. In public, my husband was flawless. He knew exactly when to place his hand on my back, when to smile, when to speak about responsibility and sacrifice as if they were virtues he carried effortlessly. At dinners and gatherings, people leaned in when he talked. They admired his dedication to family, the way he balanced tradition with modern life. I stood beside him, nodding at the right moments, feeling like a well-chosen accessory. The performance was precise. Compliments came wrapped in admiration. "You can tell a man by the woman beside him," someone once said, glancing at me with approval. Another added, "He's lucky to have someone so understanding." They meant it kindly, they always did. And every time they said it, I felt the weight of the role settle more firmly on my shoulders. I began to understand that I wasn't there to be heard, I was there to confirm the story. My presence validated everything he claimed to be. When he spoke about long hours, I smiled to show support. When he mentioned obligations that pulled him away, I nodded to prove patience. My silence filled in the gaps, smoothing over any doubts others might have had. It never occurred to them that my restraint wasn't admiration, it was calculation. From a distance, our marriage looked enviable. From inside it, it felt rehearsed. I started noticing the choreography, the way his explanations were always just detailed enough to sound honest, the way his absences were framed as sacrifices, the way affection appeared in public, but retreated into efficiency at home. None of it was dramatic. That was what made it convincing. There were details that didn't fit, small at first, then recurring. Trips that overlapped in odd ways. Financial movements explained vaguely, as if specifics were unnecessary. Emotional gaps disguised as fatigue or duty. Each inconsistency could be explained on its own. Together they formed a pattern that refused to settle. I didn't accuse him, I didn't question him directly, I watched. The family helped maintain the illusion without ever being asked. Conversations shifted when I entered a room, not abruptly, but smoothly, like a practiced turn. If someone brought up a topic too close to reality, another would redirect with a joke or a compliment. I noticed how often my understanding nature was praised at exactly the moments when understanding was most convenient. It took me time to accept what that meant. This wasn't about protecting feelings. It was about preserving a structure. The image they defended was larger than my marriage. It was tied to reputation, to standing, to the belief that certain families were immune to scandal because they handled their problems quietly. And I was part of how they handled them. I never believed the image myself. I knew it was a surface, polished and maintained. I just hadn't known what it was hiding. That distinction mattered. I wasn't fooled. I was participating, knowingly or not, in something designed to function without my input. Once I understood that, my role shifted in my own mind. I began to separate the performance from the reality beneath it. The more perfect the image appeared, the more fragile it seemed. It required constant reinforcement, constant agreement. One wrong question, one misplaced doubt, and the balance could tilt. That was why they guarded it so carefully. That was why they needed me quiet. Maintaining the illusion cost me more than I admitted at the time. It cost honesty. It cost ease. It cost the freedom to ask simple questions without being reminded of consequences. I learned to carry discomfort privately, to translate it into composure. People mistook that for strength. In some ways, they weren't wrong. But endurance is not the same as consent. As the weeks passed, I stopped measuring our marriage by how it looked and started measuring it by how it functioned. Who benefited? Who adjusted? Who was expected to absorb uncertainty without explanation? The answers were consistent. And consistency, I had learned, reveals intent. I realized something else then, something that settled in quietly and refused to leave. The image they worked so hard to protect was also their greatest weakness. The more invested they were in appearing untouchable, the less prepared they were for anything that challenged it. They relied on admiration the way others rely on locks. They believed no one would dare disturb what looked so complete. Standing beside my husband at another gathering, listening to him speak with practiced sincerity, I understood the risk he was taking without realizing it. He assumed the story was strong enough to carry him forever. He assumed my silence was permanent, unconditional. He was wrong about both. I didn't plan anything that night. I didn't need to. I simply watched him accept praise, watched the family close ranks around him, watched how easily people believed what they wanted to see. And as the room filled with approval, one clear thought settled into place. Anything built this carefully is not built to withstand the truth. And when it finally comes apart, it won't shatter loudly. It will collapse under its own weight. The first crack appeared on an afternoon that should have meant nothing. I was sorting through a stack of mail, half paying attention, when a name I didn't recognize caught my eye. It wasn't dramatic, just unfamiliar. The kind of detail most people would skim past without a second thought. I held the envelope longer than necessary, feeling that faint resistance in my chest that comes when something doesn't align. I told myself it was nothing. People's names cross our lives all the time: vendors, administrators, distant connections. Still, I turned the envelope over again, reading it more carefully than the rest. The wording was precise. Too precise. It referred to an arrangement that had been explained to me before in broader terms, always with a casual tone, as if the specifics were unimportant. Specifics are never unimportant. That evening I asked a neutral question, not an accusation, not even curiosity disguised as concern. Just a simple clarification, the kind any reasonable person would ask. My husband answered immediately. Too immediately. His response came polished, complete, as if he had been waiting for the question. He didn't stumble or hesitate. He smiled, reassured me, and added an extra detail that wasn't necessary. I noticed the speed more than the explanation. I nodded and thanked him. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, something shifted. When answers arrive before questions have time to form, it's rarely coincidence. It's preparation. The next day, without prompting, his mother referenced the same issue. She used almost the same language. Not identical, but close enough that I felt the echo. She framed it as concern, as something she thought might have confused me. Her tone was gentle, practiced. The implication was clear. This was being handled. That was the moment I understood I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with management. I stopped asking questions after that, not because I was satisfied, but because I no longer needed reassurance. I began doing something else instead. I paid attention. I replayed past conversations, past explanations, past moments I had dismissed because I trusted the people delivering them. Patterns emerged where isolated incidents once stood. I thought about timelines, about how often plans changed at the last minute, about financial decisions presented as urgent but never fully explained, about absences justified by responsibility rather than choice. None of it was outrageous on its own. Together, it formed a structure that relied heavily on my acceptance. I realized then that confronting them would be pointless. Questions would only tighten the circle around me. The family had already shown me how they responded to curiosity, with rehearsed unity, with concern that felt suspiciously like warning. If I pushed now, I wouldn't get truth. I would get pressure. Silence at that point wasn't retreat. It was access. I crossed an internal line quietly. I stopped assuming good faith. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but with clarity. This wasn't about trust anymore. It was about control, and control leaves traces. It requires coordination. It depends on routines being followed and roles remaining fixed. I began to see my own role more clearly. My presence wasn't incidental. It was necessary. The structure functioned because I played my part. Because I didn't interrupt. Because I smoothed edges instead of exposing them. They weren't afraid of me reacting emotionally. They were afraid of me stepping out of alignment. That realization steadied me. I didn't search for proof, not yet. Proof makes noise. It creates urgency. What I needed was coherence. I needed to understand how the system held together before I touched it. So I watched, I listened, I remembered. I let them believe their explanations had worked. They mistook my quiet for relief. At a family dinner later that week, the atmosphere was almost warm. Laughter returned too easily. Someone commented on how good it was to see everyone relaxed again. I recognized the subtext. The problem had been contained. I had been contained. They congratulated themselves without realizing it. Sitting there, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not even sadness. Distance. The kind that comes when you finally see the outline of a structure you've been living inside without understanding its shape. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I understood why they spoke so carefully, why explanations traveled in pairs, why my husband never defended himself alone. This wasn't about protecting one man. It was about protecting a system that required collective belief. A system that could only survive if everyone played their part and no one questioned the framework itself. By the end of that night, I was certain of one thing. The crack I had noticed hadn't closed. It had been covered, and coverings require effort. They require vigilance. They reveal where pressure is applied. Whatever they were hiding needed coordination. It needed silence, and most of all, it needed me to remain exactly where I was. I let them believe I would. The shift was subtle at first, the kind of change you only notice when you're already paying attention. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when I entered a room, then resumed with safer topics. Glances were exchanged just long enough to register, then quickly disguised as smiles. No one said my name, but everything suddenly seemed to orbit around my presence. That was when I understood this wasn't accidental anymore. The family had closed ranks. It happened without announcements or arguments. There was no meeting where they decided how to handle me. They didn't need one. Everyone already knew their part. The system had been running for years, polished through habit and mutual benefit. All it required was alignment, and alignment came naturally to people who believed they were protecting something valuable. One afternoon, my husband's sister asked if we could talk. She chose her words carefully, leading with concern, with affection. She told me she admired my strength, how much I'd carried without complaint. Then she lowered her voice and said she wanted to help me avoid unnecessary stress. "For your own good," she said. That phrase landed heavier than anything else she could have said. She didn't accuse me of anything. She didn't even mention specifics. She spoke instead about how fragile reputations could be, how easily misunderstandings could spiral when outsiders got involved. She reminded me of how much the family had worked to build what they had. The implication was clear. Curiosity was dangerous. Silence was responsible. I thanked her. I told her I understood. She looked relieved. What she didn't see was how detached I felt as she spoke, how her concern registered less as care and more as confirmation. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about containment, about keeping everything exactly where it was. From then on, the pressure became more refined. No one confronted me directly. Instead, values were used as weights. Tradition, loyalty, sacrifice. Each was presented as something I already believed in, something that obligated me to continue behaving the way I always had. They reminded me of what I'd endured before, as if past endurance meant future compliance. They spoke about family as if it were a fragile heirloom that could only survive if I handled it gently. What they didn't acknowledge was how easily that heirloom had been weaponized. My husband, for his part, seemed calmer than ever. There was a lightness to him I hadn't seen in months. He spoke with certainty, with the confidence of someone who believed the crisis had passed. When he looked at me, there was no fear in his eyes, only reassurance. He didn't need to threaten or explain. The system was doing the work for him. That told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't brave, he was protected. I realized then how little effort he had to expend. He relied on the family's unity the way others rely on contracts or locks. When doubt appeared, someone else handled it. When questions surfaced, they were redirected before reaching him. His role was to remain calm and let the structure hold. And it did, until it didn't. As the days passed, my isolation became complete. There was no one in the family I could speak to without their words looping back into the same narrative. Every conversation served the same purpose, delivered through different voices. It was almost impressive in its efficiency. I felt alone, but not abandoned. Isolation, when you expect it, sharpens your focus. I stopped looking for understanding. I stopped seeking reassurance. I stopped hoping someone would break ranks. Instead, I began asking a different question. What were they protecting exactly? The answer wasn't a feeling. It wasn't a relationship. It was a structure that depended on uninterrupted cooperation. Money moved in predictable ways. Permissions were assumed, not requested. Legalities were treated as formalities rather than safeguards. The family didn't concern itself with infrastructure because infrastructure had never failed them. That was their mistake. I stopped trying to understand their explanations and started mapping their dependencies. Where things overlapped, where assumptions replaced verification, where my role, so carefully minimized, quietly supported everything else. The more I saw, the clearer it became. This wasn't about stopping me from discovering the truth. It was about preventing me from realizing how much leverage I already held. They believed I was manageable because I had always been agreeable. They mistook my willingness to keep peace for an inability to disrupt it. There was a moment, sitting alone at the kitchen table late one evening, when I felt the last thread of hesitation loosen. Not because I was angry, but because I was certain. I no longer needed explanations from them. I didn't need admissions or apologies. I needed timing. The family had shown me who they were when threatened. Not defensive, not remorseful, but coordinated. That told me everything about what would happen if I confronted them. They would close ranks tighter. They would escalate pressure. They would frame me as the problem. So I chose a different path. I stepped back emotionally without stepping away physically. I continued to attend gatherings. I listened. I nodded. I let them believe their strategy had worked. From their perspective, I had accepted my place. I had chosen harmony over disruption, loyalty over curiosity. What they couldn't see was that by closing ranks, they had finally given the enemy a shape. And once you can see the system clearly, you don't need to fight it head-on. You only need to know where it depends on you most. They underestimated me because they never asked the right questions. They assumed that because I didn't argue, I didn't understand. Because I didn't push back, I didn't notice. They saw my calm as emptiness, my silence as absence. And in doing so, they missed the one thing that mattered most. They assumed I wouldn't read what I signed. Years earlier, when my husband's responsibilities began to expand, paperwork followed. Forms were brought home in neat folders. Pages were flipped quickly, explanations delivered casually, always with the same reassuring tone. Just standard procedure. Nothing for you to worry about. We just need your signature here. I had been praised for being easy, for trusting. It never occurred to them that trust didn't prevent me from paying attention. I remember the first time I paused over a document. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden realization, no racing heartbeat. Just a line that felt heavier than the rest. A clause buried in careful language, outlining authority rather than obligation. It wasn't framed as power, it was framed as convenience. Something meant to streamline processes, to make things easier for everyone involved. I didn't ask about it. Asking would have drawn attention. Instead, I learned. I took my time. I read on my own. I clarified terms quietly, without involving anyone connected to my husband or his family. I understood what I was being asked to hold long before anyone realized I had done more than sign. The role they handed me, assuming it was symbolic, carried weight. Legal weight, structural weight. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it's removed. No one monitored it because no one thought they needed to. They trusted me because I had always been trustworthy. They relied on my discretion because discretion was the quality they valued most in me. The irony wasn't lost on me later. The very traits they praised were the ones that allowed the arrangement to function unseen. Stability, patience, reliability. Those were not weaknesses, they were access. For a long time, I didn't consider using what I held. Not because I couldn't, but because I wasn't certain. Power exercised without clarity becomes collateral damage. I needed to know exactly what I was interrupting before I touched it. I needed to understand not just what the structure was, but why it existed. As the family closed ranks and explanations turned rehearsed, that clarity came into focus. What they were protecting depended on continuity, on the assumption that nothing would change because nothing ever had. Their confidence rested on the belief that I would always choose harmony over disruption. They never imagined I would choose responsibility over silence. There was a moment when I realized how complete their miscalculation was. It came not in anger, but in calm recognition. They had built an entire system around my cooperation without ever considering my consent. They had confused endurance with permission, and they had done it so thoroughly that the idea of resistance simply never occurred to them. That was when possibility became inevitability. I understood then that the family's unity wasn't strength. It was dependence. Each person played a role that assumed the others would remain exactly where they were. No one considered what would happen if a single point of compliance disappeared. Systems rarely do. They focus on maintenance, not failure. By that point, I no longer felt rushed. Timing was no longer a question of urgency, but of precision. I knew what would happen if I acted too early. I knew what would happen if I waited too long. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that when the moment came, it would only take one step. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't imagine confrontations. I didn't prepare for reactions. None of that mattered. The power I held didn't require permission or explanation. It was designed to function quietly, efficiently, and without emotion, just like the system it supported. What surprised me most was how little resentment I felt. This wasn't about punishment. It was about alignment, about correcting something that had been allowed to operate under false assumptions. I wasn't taking anything that wasn't already mine to manage. I was simply choosing not to hold it together anymore. They thought the family was the shield. They never considered the infrastructure beneath it. By the end of that realization, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger, not satisfaction, certainty. The kind that doesn't need reinforcement. The kind that comes when you finally see how everything fits together and where it can come apart. They believed control came from keeping me quiet. What they never understood was that the one thing they couldn't control was the authority they handed to the wrong person, assuming she would never use it. When the time came, there would be no warning, no raised voices, no dramatic exits. Just a decision they never thought I would make. And once it was made, nothing they had built would be able to stand without me holding it up. The truth didn't arrive with a confession. No one sat me down. No one admitted anything in a moment of guilt or panic. It came to me the way real truths often do, quietly, impersonally, without asking how I felt about it. I saw it in a record that wasn't meant to be emotional, a trail that existed whether I looked at it or not. Dates, locations, confirmations that didn't bend to explanation. It took only a few minutes for the pieces to align, and when they did, there was no shock. Just recognition. My husband wasn't just having an affair. He had built a second life abroad. The woman lived in another country, far enough away to stay invisible, close enough to be supported without drawing attention, and she had given birth to his child. Not recently, not suddenly, but long enough ago that the arrangement had already settled into routine. Support had been structured, plans had been adjusted. The logistics were careful, deliberate, and designed to remain unseen. As I traced the timeline, everything else fell into place. The unexplained trips, the emergencies that required immediate funds, the periods of emotional absence justified by family obligations, even the urgency with which his parents had urged me to stay quiet. It wasn't about protecting him from embarrassment. It was about protecting a system that was already operating smoothly. The family knew, or if they didn't know every detail, they knew enough. They had to. The coordination made sense now, the rehearsed explanations, the way questions were intercepted before they reached him, the moral pressure placed on me whenever curiosity surfaced. This wasn't one man lying alone. This was a structure. What surprised me most was what I didn't feel. There was no rush of anger, no surge of grief. I didn't cry, I didn't shake. I felt distance, as if the truth had created space rather than pain. That space allowed me to see things clearly, without the blur of emotion they might have expected. I understood then why they had been so confident. They believed I would never risk exposing a child, that I would confuse responsibility with silence. They assumed that because I valued family, I would protect the lie for the sake of appearances. They counted on my restraint the way others count on locks or walls. They mistook restraint for compliance. I was careful not to direct my anger where it didn't belong. The child was not the betrayal. The child was evidence, proof of how long the lie had been sustained, how much effort had gone into preserving it. Whatever harm existed came from the decisions made by adults who believed they could divide their lives without consequence. Once I knew, I stopped revisiting the discovery. I didn't reread the records. I didn't search for more confirmation. I didn't need it. The truth was complete. It stood on its own. What mattered now was what it revealed about everyone involved. The family's urgency to silence me was no longer puzzling. Their fear wasn't about scandal, it was about exposure of their participation. The shield they had formed around my husband wasn't accidental. It was necessary. Without their cooperation, the arrangement would have collapsed under its own complexity. They had protected him not because they believed he was right, but because the alternative threatened them all. I thought back to every time I had been told not to make things bigger than they needed to be. Every reminder of how much the family had invested in its reputation. Every compliment about my strength, my understanding, my maturity. Those words weren't appreciation. They were insurance. They believed I would stay quiet because I always had. Because I had proven, again and again, that I could endure discomfort without demanding explanation. They believed my silence was rooted in fear of loss. They never considered that silence could also be rooted in choice. That night, sitting alone, I realized that uncertainty had been the only thing holding me in place. As long as I didn't know for certain, action felt premature. Now, certainty removed hesitation entirely. The system had exposed itself, and in doing so, it had revealed exactly where it was vulnerable. The truth didn't demand confrontation. It didn't require raised voices or public accusations. It simply needed to be released from the structure that depended on it staying hidden. I understood then why my position mattered so much, why my cooperation had always been assumed. The lie didn't survive because it was clever. It survived because everyone involved believed I would never act against it. They believed my values would protect them. They were wrong. By the end of that night, knowledge had turned into intent. Not rage-driven, not impulsive, but precise. I knew what the truth required from me, and it wasn't confession. It was action, quiet, deliberate, irreversible. I didn't need to threaten anyone. I didn't need to warn them. The truth didn't need my voice to be heard. It only needed me to stop holding everything together. And once I let go, there would be nothing left to hide behind. They thought I would stay quiet because I always had. Once the truth settled into place, their confidence hardened instead of cracking. I could feel it in the way conversations relaxed, in how the careful monitoring faded. The urgency that once hovered over every interaction dissolved into routine. From their perspective, the danger had passed. Normal returned quickly. Family dinners resumed. Plans were made without hesitation. Laughter came easier, as if the tension had been a temporary inconvenience rather than a warning. I watched them slip back into comfort, relieved by my continued presence and my continued silence. They took it as confirmation that their strategy had worked. I played my part. I showed up when expected. I listened. I smiled at the right moments. I nodded through the familiar reminders about unity and responsibility. I let them believe their words still held weight. What they mistook for acceptance was discipline. What they read as surrender was timing. My husband seemed lighter than he had in months. He was almost kind again, attentive in ways that felt rehearsed but sincere enough to pass. He spoke to me as if we had crossed a difficult chapter together and emerged stronger. In his mind, my silence meant forgiveness, or at least resignation. He didn't need to ask questions anymore. That was his mistake. He never considered that his calm depended entirely on something he didn't control. He relied on the family's shield the way someone relies on a locked door, forgetting that locks only work until the person with the key decides to turn it. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, everything had already shifted. I didn't make lists. I didn't rehearse outcomes. I didn't imagine how they would react when things began to unravel. Preparation doesn't always look like motion. Sometimes it looks like restraint. I waited, not because I was uncertain, but because certainty requires patience to be effective. There came a moment when I understood they would never stop on their own. The family's priority wasn't truth or resolution, it was preservation. As long as the structure held, they would continue reinforcing it, smoothing over cracks, dismissing discomfort. If left undisturbed, the lie would stretch forward indefinitely, supported by silence and routine. That realization removed the last trace of hesitation. They still spoke to me about strength, about how well I handled things, about how lucky they were to have someone so composed. Each compliment landed like a final confirmation of how thoroughly they misunderstood me. They praised the very traits that made their system vulnerable, unaware that discipline and patience are also the qualities required to dismantle something carefully. One small interaction sealed it. A casual remark, delivered without thought, about how everything had settled down nicely. It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was meant to be reassuring. In that moment, I saw the full extent of their confidence. They believed the situation was closed. They believed I had chosen peace over disruption. They never asked what kind of peace I had chosen. By then, the decision had already been made. Not dramatically, not in a rush of emotion, but quietly, the way decisions that matter most often are. I didn't feel nervous. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. The kind of alignment that comes when action finally matches understanding. Silence had protected them for a long time. It allowed their arrangement to function without scrutiny. It gave them time, comfort, and cover. They assumed it would continue to do so because it always had. They never considered that silence could also be withdrawn. I understood exactly what would happen once I acted, not in detail, not in scenes, but in structure. I knew where pressure would travel, how dependencies would react, how quickly confidence would turn into urgency. The collapse wouldn't be loud at first. It would move through systems, not conversations. That was why I waited, not for courage, but for clarity. When you hold something together long enough, you learn where it breaks. And when you stop holding it, gravity takes over. From the outside, I remained the woman they had always known, calm, reasonable, understanding. Inside, I was already stepping away from the role they had assigned me. The part of me that once smoothed edges had gone still, conserving energy for a single, precise movement. They believed I would stay quiet because quiet had always served them well. They didn't realize that quiet, when chosen, is not submission, it is control. And when control shifts hands, it doesn't announce itself. It simply acts. By the time they sensed something was wrong, the decision would no longer be mine to reconsider. It would already be moving through the structures they trusted, doing what it was designed to do. They thought my silence meant safety. They never understood that it was the calm before everything they built began to fall. I chose an ordinary morning because ordinary moments draw the least attention. There was no argument waiting to happen, no emotional tension hanging in the air. My husband had already left for the day, confident enough to move through his routine without checking whether anything had shifted behind him. The house was quiet in the way it always was when everything was supposedly fine. That was why it was the right moment. I didn't rush. I made coffee. I stood by the window and watched the street wake up, people heading to work, lives moving forward on assumptions they trusted. There was something grounding in that normalcy. It reminded me that what I was about to do wasn't dramatic, it was necessary. When I sat down, the process felt familiar. I had seen these documents before. I knew where to sign, what language mattered, which details were irreversible. The authority I held didn't announce itself with weight or ceremony. It existed quietly, embedded in procedures designed to function without emotion. One decision. That was all it took. I signed where my name had always been expected, but this time with intention rather than habit. I withdrew my consent from a structure that depended on it. I triggered a process that didn't require explanation or approval. It acknowledged my authority the way it always had, without questioning why it was being exercised now. There was no hesitation in my hand, no sense of crossing a line. I wasn't destroying anything. I was stepping out of a role I had never agreed to play indefinitely. What made the moment powerful wasn't the act itself, but how little resistance it encountered. Systems built on assumption rarely defend themselves well. They function smoothly until the person they rely on decides not to cooperate anymore. That decision doesn't need noise to be effective. It only needs to be final. As the confirmation appeared, I felt the shift. Not emotionally, but structurally. A point of no return marked not by drama, but by procedure. Once the process was set in motion, it could not be undone quietly. Any attempt to reverse it would require exposure, explanation, and scrutiny, exactly the things they had spent so long avoiding. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel fear. What I felt was distance, as if I had stepped off a platform I had been standing on for years without realizing how much weight I was carrying. The relief wasn't lightness. It was alignment. For a moment, nothing seemed different. The house looked the same. The day moved forward. Silence settled back into place. If someone had been watching, they would have seen nothing worth noticing. That was the beauty of it. Collapse doesn't always announce itself with sound. Sometimes it begins as an absence. I understood how the consequences would travel. The system would search for the missing support and find none. Questions would be asked in the wrong places. Temporary fixes would fail. The family shield would hold for a moment, then strain under pressure it had never been designed to absorb. They would feel it before they understood it. I went about my day as usual. I answered messages. I kept my voice steady. I didn't wait for reactions. There was no need. The decision was already moving through channels that didn't care about feelings or intentions. They only cared about compliance, and compliance had just been withdrawn. Later, I received the first sign. Not from my husband, not from his family, but from the system itself. A notification, neutral in tone, confirming that the process had advanced exactly as it was meant to. No drama, no warning, just acknowledgement. That was when I knew the collapse had begun. They still believed they were protected. They still believed silence was on their side. They had no idea that the thing they depended on most had already been removed. They would wake up to consequences without understanding where they had started. I didn't rehearse what I would say when questions came. I didn't prepare explanations or defenses. The truth didn't require my voice anymore. It was already embedded in the outcome. What struck me most was how small the decision felt compared to the weight it carried. One step, taken calmly, undone years of assumption and entitlement. It exposed how fragile their arrangement had always been, how dependent it was on my willingness to hold everything together without asking why. I sat with that understanding, letting it settle. They had built their protection around family, reputation, and silence. They believed those things were unbreakable because they had never been challenged. They forgot that every structure has a point of failure, and that point is usually where trust is taken for granted. I didn't need to confront anyone. I didn't need to make demands. I didn't need to explain myself. The decision had already done the work. And as the day continued, as the world carried on without noticing what had shifted beneath the surface, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom, not as escape, but as release. They thought control meant keeping me quiet. They never understood that the moment I stopped holding everything together, the system would do the rest on its own. And it had already begun. The first signs didn't come to me directly. They rarely do. Systems don't announce their failures to the people who trigger them. They falter elsewhere first, in places where expectation meets absence. I noticed it in the delays, in the sudden urgency of messages that weren't meant for me, in the way responses that used to arrive smoothly began to stutter. Nothing dramatic, just friction. Phone calls ended abruptly when I entered a room. Conversations lowered in volume, then stopped. Doors closed more often than they used to. The family, once so confident in their unity, moved with a new kind of tension. It was the tension of people who know something is wrong but don't yet know where to look. My husband changed next. Not all at once, but in fragments. He grew restless. He checked his phone more often. His calm took on an edge, like someone trying to hold water in cupped hands. He didn't explain anything. He didn't need to. Anxiety has a way of announcing itself without words. I watched without commenting. Observation had become second nature by then. The structure I had stopped supporting was doing exactly what structures do when a key component is removed. It searched for stability. It failed to find it. Temporary adjustments were made. They didn't hold. The family's confidence cracked into confusion. Meetings happened without invitations. Decisions were delayed, then rushed. I could feel the shift in how they looked at me, as if I might suddenly have answers they hadn't considered before. No one asked directly. They were still hoping to fix things quietly. That hope didn't last. The system revealed its dependencies one by one. Where money had flowed predictably, it stalled. Where permissions had been assumed, they were questioned. Processes that relied on discretion now demanded verification. The shield the family had relied on worked only as long as everything remained invisible. Once pressure was applied, invisibility became impossible. The questions finally came, careful and indirect. Had I noticed anything unusual? Did I know why certain arrangements were being reviewed? Was there something I might have overlooked? I answered honestly and minimally. I hadn't noticed anything unusual. I didn't know why reviews were happening. I hadn't overlooked anything. All of it was true. What they wanted was reassurance. What they got was neutrality. The moment of realization arrived without ceremony. A formal notice, delivered through official channels, landed like a weight no one could lift. It was clear, specific, and irreversible. Whatever had once been handled privately was now subject to scrutiny that couldn't be redirected or softened. I saw it in their faces when they understood. Not anger, not outrage, recognition. The shield had failed. They looked at each other first, then at me. Not accusing, not pleading, just searching. For the first time since I had known them, the family had no script, no rehearsed phrases, no moral reminders ready to deploy. The structure they trusted had turned against them, not because of malice, but because it had been built on assumption. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to add. My husband stood apart from them then, no longer buffered by their unity. Without the system holding him upright, his confidence had nowhere to rest. He wasn't defiant. He wasn't remorseful. He was exposed. For the first time, he had to face consequences without someone else stepping in to absorb them. I felt no urge to confront him. Confrontation would have implied negotiation, and there was nothing left to negotiate. The process was moving forward on its own, indifferent to emotion or intent. Gravity had taken over. The aftermath unfolded in stages. Some people tried to fix things, others tried to understand how it had happened. A few tried to place blame. None of it mattered. The truth no longer needed a voice. It was embedded in outcomes, in denials that couldn't be appealed quietly, in questions that demanded answers in public terms. I remained where I was, calm and present. I didn't hide. I didn't explain. My restraint stood in stark contrast to their urgency, and that contrast spoke louder than any accusation could have. They had relied on my silence to maintain control. Now my silence belonged to me. As the days passed, it became clear that the collapse didn't need me anymore. It was self-sustaining. Each attempt to patch the damage revealed more of what had been hidden. Each explanation created new questions. The family's power had always depended on discretion. Once discretion was gone, so was their advantage. I watched the truth circulate without my involvement, moving through channels that didn't care about loyalty or reputation. Institutions don't negotiate with image. They respond to facts. And facts, once released, have a way of finding their way to the surface. There was a strange calm in that realization. I didn't need to push or prove anything. The system had corrected itself in the only way it knew how, by exposing the imbalance that had been allowed to persist for so long. The collapse wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with shouting or public scenes. It arrived with paperwork, with closed doors, with conversations that stopped when answers couldn't be supplied. It arrived with consequences that couldn't be softened by family unity. When it was over, when the frantic motion slowed into something like acceptance, I understood the full weight of what had happened. Not because I had acted boldly, but because I had acted precisely. They believed control meant keeping me quiet. They never considered what would happen when the structure they depended on no longer had me holding it together. By the time they realized, it was too late. The truth didn't need me anymore. It was already standing on its own. After everything fell apart, the silence was what surprised me most. Not the absence of noise, but the way certainty drained from the rooms they used to control. The phone stopped ringing. Messages came slower, then not at all. When I entered a space, conversations didn't just pause, they dissolved, as if no one was sure what could be said anymore. For years, silence had been mine to manage. Now it belonged to them. I watched the family move through the aftermath in fragments. Some avoided eye contact entirely, as if looking at me might force an acknowledgement they weren't ready to make. Others hovered on the edge of conversations, speaking carefully, choosing words that carried no weight. A few retreated into denial, insisting the situation had been misunderstood, that things would stabilize once the initial shock passed. None of them asked me to explain anything. They didn't need to. The truth had already rearranged the ground beneath them. Shame has a way of stripping authority without raising its voice. I saw it in the way they held themselves now, shoulders tight, movements restrained, confidence replaced by caution. The moral pressure they once wielded so easily had evaporated. They could no longer frame themselves as guardians of harmony while standing inside the wreckage of a lie. My husband changed the most. Without the family's protection, he had nowhere to place his certainty. The ease he once carried like armor was gone, replaced by something thinner and less convincing. He moved through the house as if it no longer recognized him, careful not to draw attention, unsure of his footing. For the first time, he stood alone. There were moments when he looked at me as if expecting something, anger, accusation, a demand to be heard. I gave him none of it. Not out of cruelty, but because confrontation would have given him a role to play. It would have turned consequences into negotiation. I wasn't interested in either. I felt no urge to humiliate him. Exposure had already done the work. He had lost the one thing he relied on most, the ability to hide behind others. Whatever happened next would be his to face without intermediaries, without rehearsed narratives to soften the impact. Inside me, something had shifted quietly. I no longer measured myself by how well I endured. I no longer mistook patience for virtue or silence for duty. The woman who once smoothed edges instinctively had stepped aside, replaced by someone who understood the difference between peace and erasure. I thought about how often I had been praised for holding everything together, how frequently my restraint had been framed as strength, my compliance as loyalty. I saw now how those compliments had functioned, not as recognition, but as reinforcement. They kept me in place while others benefited from my stillness. That understanding didn't make me bitter, it made me clear. Family, I realized, is not defined by proximity or shared names. It is defined by accountability, by the willingness to protect truth, even when it threatens comfort. What I had been asked to preserve wasn't family. It was an arrangement that required my silence to survive. Once I named that difference, the guilt I had carried for years loosened its grip. I thought about the child abroad then, not as an abstract symbol, but as a real life shaped by decisions made long before I ever knew the truth. The child wasn't the betrayal. The child was the consequence of one. I refused to let misplaced anger turn innocence into a weapon. Responsibility belonged exactly where it always had, with the adults who believed they could divide their lives without cost. That clarity mattered to me. It was the line that kept my actions grounded, my intent clean. I didn't offer explanations. I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask to be understood. Letting go meant releasing the need for validation from people who had never intended to see me clearly. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was spacious. Days passed. The urgency faded into something more permanent. Acceptance, perhaps. Or exhaustion. Either way, the pressure that once circled me had lifted. I moved through my life without anticipating resistance, without bracing for correction. The absence of that weight felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping into open air after years indoors. I noticed small things then, how my breath settled more easily, how decisions no longer carried the echo of other people's expectations, how silence, once imposed, now felt chosen. There is power in not needing to explain yourself to people who have already lost their authority over your story. I understood, finally, that my role in all of this was complete. The truth no longer required my attention. It had found its footing and would continue without me carrying it forward. I didn't need to monitor outcomes or measure losses. What mattered had already been restored: balance, dignity, choice. As I closed that chapter of my life, I felt something close to relief, but steadier, quieter. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Power, I learned, isn't proven by how loudly you respond to betrayal. It's proven by how little you need to respond at all. And when you stop holding everything together for people who never intended to carry their share, what's left isn't emptiness. It's yourself. The life that followed didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded quietly, the way real change often does, without announcements or witnesses. Mornings became simpler. Decisions became smaller and more honest. I stopped measuring my days by how well I managed other people's expectations and started noticing what it felt like to move without resistance. There was no victory parade, no moment where I stood back and admired the damage left behind. That had never been the point. What mattered was the absence of fear where it used to live. The tension that once hummed beneath every interaction was gone, replaced by something steadier and more sustainable. I thought often about how close I had come to believing the story they told me about myself, that I was too gentle to act, too concerned with harmony to disrupt it, too invested in family to risk its approval. Those labels had been repeated so often they almost became truths. Almost. What they never understood was that patience is not passivity, silence is not surrender, and loyalty, when demanded without honesty, is not a virtue at all. I didn't rebuild my life by proving anyone wrong. I rebuilt it by choosing myself without asking permission, by letting go of roles that required my erasure, by recognizing that dignity does not need consensus to exist. Family, I learned, can be a shelter or a weapon. When it's used to protect wrongdoing, it loses its moral authority. When it demands silence at the cost of truth, it forfeits its claim to loyalty. I didn't destroy a family. I stepped away from a lie that was using family as camouflage. That distinction matters. I moved forward without bitterness, but also without nostalgia. Some relationships cannot be repaired because they were never built on mutual respect to begin with. Letting them end was not a failure. It was an acknowledgement of reality. The most surprising part was how little explanation my new life required. People adjusted. The world continued. What once felt like a monumental risk turned out to be a necessary correction. The fear that had kept me quiet for so long dissolved once it was faced directly. I became careful with my energy after that. Intentional. I no longer rushed to smooth discomfort or absorb blame that wasn't mine. Peace stopped being something I negotiated for and became something I protected. There is a quiet power in knowing that you don't need to raise your voice to be heard, that you don't need to destroy to reclaim yourself, that sometimes the most decisive act is the one that happens without spectacle. I don't regret the silence that came before. It taught me how systems rely on the unspoken. It showed me where the true leverage lives. But I also don't romanticize it. Silence is only powerful when it's chosen. When it's imposed, it becomes a cage. What I reclaimed wasn't revenge, it was authorship. If there's one truth I carry forward, it's this. The person who appears the most compliant often holds the most control. Not because they are calculating, but because they understand timing. Because they see the structure clearly enough to know where a single decision can change everything. I didn't need to scream, expose, or beg. I needed to stop cooperating with a lie. And that was enough. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been told to stay quiet for the sake of family, reputation, or peace, know that your silence is yours to keep or release. No one else gets to decide when it ends. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories about hidden power, quiet decisions, and the moments when everything turns, take a second to let me know. Leave a comment, share what stood out to you, and stay here with us. Subscribing helps these stories find the people who need them most. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that don't shout. They simply tell the truth. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.